I just wanted to meet you and hear about your work here and your experience with planting trees. How did you get involved with this organization?
It was a little bit roundabout because my background actually isn't in forestry. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in geography and then natural resource management. My brother actually was a forester and he used to work during the summer here at IFA, like the Icelandic Forestry Association. So when I came back from doing my master's, I was like, okay, there are, various different fields that I was interested in. And because I knew the people here a little bit, because my brother had worked here, I sort of approached them, okay, is there anything here? And I was hired initially for 3 months. And that was 16 years ago, and I'm still here.
Amazing.
My job here within the organization is a lot to do with the outreach and education, international communication. Like I said, I'm not a forester, so I don't necessarily know all the different tree species, or like, oh, this is this type of birch and this is this type of spruce, but I know the big picture. What does this forest do for us? And of course, a lot of what we are doing here, because we are an umbrella organization for local forestry associations, a lot of what we're doing is more social, like we're interacting with the people in our members association. Like one of the projects I supervise is providing plants for school children to plant. So I'm a lot of contact with the schools all over the country. And, it's a small organization, so everybody has to be able to wear different hats. So like some days I'm the proofreader, sometimes I'm the website manager, sometimes I'm the editor of the journal, sometimes I'm the contact for the association, sometimes I'm the person fielding inquiries from both domestic and international journalists. It's a very variable what I do, so which is what makes the job really, really interesting. And also because we are learning and getting in contact with people all over the country and working with people, both our member association, municipalities, the government, or the Iceland Forest Service, which is the governmental agency responsible for forestry. So it's varied, which is good, because I'm not doing the same thing all day, every day.
What does the school children planting kind of look like?
It varies a little bit between the schools. So basically what I do, because there is a fund that was set up specifically to buy the plants. So what my job is to receive the applications from the schools that want to take part. And this is just primary school, so kids age 6 to 16, thereabouts. Most of the schools, like the largest group schools, have 5th grade, and the smaller, more rural schools, they have the entire school taking part. It varies a little bit. And basically we just take the applications and then deliver the plants to them, and they sort of take it from there. In many cases, they are working with some of our member associations. They can be working with a forestry farmer. In some cases, they just have knowledgeable teachers in the school. There's one school actually where the teachers union in the school owns a bit of land nearby, where they've been taking part for 20 years. So they're at the point now where they're still planting trees, but they also began felling trees and using the timber in the craft teaching in school. A lot of our forests here are very, very young. So we have, for most of the 20th century, it was creeping a little bit up, and it was only in the sort of 1990s that we had a massive jump in the trees that were planted. So it's only right about now that we get the forest farmers, for example, beginning to thin. And so we haven't had that much material. Most of the material, for example, we don't have a lot of old timber houses. Most of them are like 20th century. One of the ideas, though, and one of the impetus for engaging with forestry when it began at the turn of the 20th century was to get products, because we were importing. At that point there was people still heating with coal, so they were looking at, okay, we want the trees so we can get heating for the houses. We solved that with geothermal energy in most places. That has always been part of the discussion. We trying to generate a resource here within the country for use here, rather than having to import all the timber that we use. And now that the added dimension to that is that if you can grow the trees that we need here, then that reduces the carbon footprint as well.
Right, for shipping.
Yeah, for shipping. And it's also linked to the fact that people are now looking into more taking the mitigation measures necessary to combat climate change more seriously. And like one of the things there is, for example, trying to use more climate-friendly building materials. And for example, wood is a more climate-friendly building material than concrete. So there is just increased demand in wood as a renewable resource for a lot of different things. But we've certainly always been also promoting what you call urban forestry. There is research that shows having a lot of trees in the urban area environment has a multitude of positive effects. It mitigates the temperature, it helps with the pollution from the cars and everything. There's even studies that show that more green areas have lower crime rates and everything. So it's
Really?
Yes.
Do you think people are just happier?
It is like less stress, I think, because that is also sort of the public health issue is also something that has been sort of coming a little bit into focus in the past 15 years or so. It's just the impact of access to nature in general. And in Sweden, for example, they have been experimenting with, instead of getting a prescription for antidepressants, you get, you have to go out and be in the forest for an hour. That has been demonstrably proven to help people that are dealing with mental health. Yeah, and there's also this hypothesis that because the trees are emitting all sorts of different materials from them, like there's chemical components that the trees are releasing, and some of them might be beneficial for us. So they have a term for it in Japanese called shinrin-yoku, which literally means forest bathing. So they just go there and just are out in the forest and just absorbing the forest.
I'm curious if this culture that surrounds this organization is something that is broadly embraced by people here.
It's like the few studies that have been done on people's views towards forestry has shown that 90% of the people here approve of forestry. They like forest. And a lot of it has to do with just the recreational opportunities that the forest provides. If you've ever been here in Iceland during winter when it's cold outside, being able to go into a forest where it's more sheltered and less windy, because Iceland is a very windy country, it extends the sort of potential for outdoor recreation so much. And we noticed it particularly during COVID, when the gyms were closed and a lot of the pools were closed. We saw a massive increase in the number of people that were going into the recreation forest that we have here. It's because that the sort of movement that people could get because they couldn't go to the gym anymore. Everything slowed down. There's a lot of people that are like, I'm not going to travel abroad because there was a hassle with ever-changing regulations regarding quarantine and not quarantine and, proof of this and that. So there was also just more people here in Iceland that were traveling domestically for the past 2 summers. And what do they do when they're going? They want to go hike someplace nice and a lot of places around the towns. Because most of the small towns and cities here in Iceland have a recreational forest on the outskirts of it. And in some cases it's almost part of, like in Kjarnaskógur for Akureyri in the north, it's part of the psyche of the people. Mm-hmm. It's very enmeshed with what it means to be from Akureyri. Of course, it's very much a part of them.
While I was out in the forests with different people from the associations, the amount of recreation around us and seeing all different kinds of people. There wasn't a stereotype of like, this is a nature lover. No. It was just everybody out enjoying it. It was so good to see.
Yeah, and it also links to the question of immigration here in Iceland, because our single largest immigration group is from Poland, which is a very forested country where they have a long established history of going out on weekends into the forest and enjoying the forest. So we have a lot of our sort of what we call nýbúar, which is the sort of recent immigrants that make use of the forest because that's just something that they grew up with in Poland and, Lithuania and the other countries.
Do you think they're making it popular?
I think yes, I would say so, because it's also just a general increase in outdoor recreation in general. But now we have a lot of people just engage more in outdoor recreation and skiing and all sorts of different types of activities that people weren't necessarily engaging with at the same level, 34 years ago.
Well, that must be so satisfying to see.
And also because the focus for most of our member association is the public. most of them are not focused on producing timber products. It's land reclamation, it's outdoor recreation, it's doing something good for the community. That's what drives the Forestry Association. I mean, some of them have reached the level where they are producing goods and products and services, which can then, be sold and help to run and fuel other projects as well.
Are you all throwing events for people, or is it more that you're helping to maintain the organization of everything so that the associations themselves can plan things?
It's a mixture of things. There are certain sort of projects that we supervise that include the associations. We also, whenever possible, like if the association is doing something, hosting something, events, like we try to publicize it, like we put it on our website and our Facebook page and everything, and try to promote the activities. If the associations come to us and want help with something or collaborate with something, then that's what we're supposed to do. I mean, we have, for example, Lífi Lundi. Basically, the idea was that pick one day in June, around the midsummer, where we would have events in the forest. We here at IFA were like promoting the entire events, but the association were organizing the events locally and promoting it a little bit locally, but we would sort of promoting it nationally. And it's always kind of led as much as possible by the association themselves. We try very hard not to like direct them too much, but rather allow them to do things at their own pace. Because the nature of our association is like any other non-governmental organization. It has like ebbs and flows. Sometimes it's very active and a lot doing, and sometimes it's a little bit more dormant. And when it's dormant, we sometimes go and try to get them a little bit going again. But by and large, we are sort of very careful trying to have it very sort of from the root up rather than top down.
Good metaphor.
Yeah, and also, I mean, we've been working with other forestry associations in Europe with international collaborations. Ours is structured a little bit uniquely because the forestry associations in Europe tend to be more professional based, so professional foresters and forest owners and people very much in the forestry sector, whereas the forestry association here is open to anybody that's interested. You don't have to own a forest, you don't have to be trained in forestry, you just have to be interested in contributing and helping out.
But that's what's drawn me to it, is this idea of volunteering. People aren't being paid necessarily for their time to contribute to this legacy. It's just a really beautiful concept.
First Forestry Association, which is now the Icelandic Forestry Association, was actually founded in 1930. And that was sort of when we had the movement of trying to get the Forestry Association back. At the same time, that was coming on the heels of the independence movement here in Iceland. Because at that point, the King of Denmark was still the sovereign head of state of Iceland. So it was very much linked back at the start. The association of members linked back to the idea that we are trying to regain our full independence. We're trying to give back to the country because we have. There was a lot of discussions in the first. What the writing done on forestry at the start was to deal with. Okay, we have eroded the land. We have denuded the forest. Like we owe it to the country to give something back and help to reclaim the forestry. And the emphasis isn't as much on that today, but it isn't completely gone. It's very much sort of linked back to the idea of trying to, like I said, reclaim forested areas, because I mean a lot of Iceland was forested back in the day. So we lost 90%, over 95% of the forest. So and now and like the emphasis shift is a little bit depending on, like in the 60s and 70s. There was the emphasis was a lot to do with erosion, because that was then the big issue in Iceland. There was a lot of erosion happening. It has calmed down a little bit, and then there was the public health aspect. Now it's the climate aspect. So like the main thrust changes a little bit, but we always sort of keep the other all the motivations. We always keep track of them as well.
It's so interesting that there is a kind of political tie. I didn't know that the start of the organization and this effort to reforest started with Iceland's independence from Denmark.
The impetus for it very much sprung from the same place. It was like we've been under a foreign rule, now we are gaining our independence, and that means we have to take responsibility for ourselves and do something for ourselves and do something for the country, because that's the legacy that we have.
Like reclaiming in a way.
Yeah, I mean the best example is that we had the national election in 1944 when we were actually occupied by the Allied forces on separation from Denmark, because then they were at that point occupied by Germany, and there was no contact between us and our ostensible Danish rulers. And at the time they had also a fundraiser for the Land Reclamation Fund. There was like at the polling stations they were selling this little pin, and the money for that went into a fund that still exists today, which is giving out money for a forestry association in particular, but also everybody that wants to do cultivation and reclaim the land here in Iceland. And it also meant like our forestry sector is relatively new, and for me, for example, I also sit on the board of Skógræktarfélag or Forest Women Iceland, which is like this group of women interested in forestry in particular, because there are certain issues that we've noticed that when we talk to our sister organizations in Europe, that they are coming from a place of very skewed gender balance in the forestry sector, because the forestry sector there is centuries old. Like they've been cutting down trees and growing trees for centuries, and the cutting down was traditionally done by big guys with axes. So it's very much a male-dominated field, and still is in many other countries. Whereas our forestry sector really only begins to expand and grow in the last 50 years and so, and that is after the women's rights movement and everything. So we are not necessarily dealing with the same social issues as some of our female colleagues in other countries.
Do you think that it's a better place to be a female forester?
I would think so, yes. I wouldn't have necessarily thought it beforehand, especially because I've been working quite a bit with colleagues in Norway and Sweden, which have the reputations for being fairly equalitarian countries. But even there, we've heard stuff from them that I was like, okay, I don't recall that this ever being an issue here. So they are still dealing with things that we are not dealing with, just because our sector is sort of more new, less traditional.
So you would say on paper the countries Denmark and Sweden and Iceland are similar in terms of women's rights and representation in government and all of these things, but then in the reality of this sector there is a slight difference. It could be also linked a little bit to the fact that we are not reached the same point in the forestry as they have. Because the studies that I've seen on their gender balances in the forestry sector in Norway and Sweden, for example, is that the biggest difference, numbers are most skewed in the end of the production chain, in the cutting down the trees, harvesting and timber sales. And we simply aren't at that point yet here in Iceland. But that also means that we have the opportunity to prevent it. Because we've seen in other countries that those activities tend to be mostly skewed towards the heaviest proportion of men working in that field. Then maybe we should put some structures in place to try to get women more interested in it when it begins to develop here in Iceland. Because we aren't at the point yet where we have a timber market and big harvesters and everything like that. Compared to most other countries, our forestry sector is fairly egalitarian, but still, if you were going to host a TV interview and invite the main heads of the forestry sector in Iceland for a panel, the head of the Forest Service is a guy. Our director here at IFA and our chairman of the board is a guy. The managing director of the National Forest Owners Association is a guy. So you would have guys
sitting in the TV panel, there were no women in sight.
Is this part of your objective? Do you very consciously consider female representation when you're organizing events?
There are two big events in the forestry sector in Iceland. One is our annual general meeting, because that we have members from the Forestry Association coming together. We have lectures during that on forestry-related topics. And then we have an annual sort of forestry conference that is run by the forestry sector in total, like with people from us, from the Icelandic Forestry Service, from the Forest Owners Association, everything. And there was one year that we just like looked at the list of people that were giving talks and was like, yeah, there's one woman out of 8. No, we need to do better. And that is something that we are sort of now trying to look at. And I, at least as far as the journal is concerned, is really trying to push the ladies. We need to be more visible. We need to have our voices heard, because what I also hear like from my colleagues in Norway and Sweden is that women don't necessarily always look at the forestry the same way as men. They tend to be, in general, sort of like, it's a generalization, but in general they tend to look at it a little bit more holistically. The guys will look at, okay, there's 5 cubics of timber standing in that forest, good. The woman will look at she will see the 5 cubics of timbers, but she will also see the berries and the mushrooms that she can pick. And this is it would be a nice picnic area, and this would So they tend to look at more things than just.
That's really interesting to hear, and I have noticed from the women that I've been speaking to that there is also a focus on the social aspect and organizing groups of people into the spaces.
Yeah. I mean that was also one of the things that we, for example, advocated for with Líf in Lundi, when we had this one day where we had vets in forest all over the country, and our emphasis has always been on it not just having the forestry associations creating events, but like if there's a yoga club that wants to arrange a meeting, a yoga session, have it out in the forest, then we will promote it during Líf in Lundi. Like we just as long as you just. The focus is on getting people out into the forest. If that is yoga class, if that is mass out in the forest, if that is a photo session, orienteering, what have you, like any association. I mean, we'll say like any association that wants to host something during Líf in Lundi, we will put it on the list of events and promote it.
That's great.
Because that is what sort of the main difference with forestry here, and for example in many of our European colleagues, is that it's very much grassroots. Like from the start, it was not. There was organized forestry in Iceland really began by not from the top down with government trying to do something, but with private individuals coming together and say, okay, we need to do something. We have erosion. We are missing. We are like importing way too much stuff, and we need to do something about it. So it's always been very much more private driven here than perhaps in many of our neighboring countries, and that means the social aspect of it is important.
It's nice to hear your perspective. It sounds like you have so much knowledge about other communities of forestry, so you're aware of how this one is unique.
Yeah. I mean, my German colleague always envied us a little bit because the German Forestry Association had half the number of people.
Oh, wow, really?
Because that was just a forestry association. It was just for foresters and forest owners and people work active within the forestry sector. So he was always a little bit jealous of our like general public grassroots movement of it.
That's the way important things happen, you know?
Yeah.
The grassroots method is powerful.
Yeah, and it also like makes things easier because we have local forestry associations and they are more familiar with, the local people and what they want, and can much more easily deal with the local municipalities than we can.
My last question is, do you have any particular memories as a child or kind of experiences that were really informative to you in your motivations for this work?
I would probably list when I was 6 years old. We did a round trip of Iceland, which drove southeast to the north and then back. And I was 6. I don't remember that much from it, but I remember really vividly when we came to Hallormsstaðaskógur, which is this big forest in the east, and one of the oldest planted forests in the country is there. And certainly, being 6 and having been raised on grim fairy tales and fairy tales where things happened in the forest, suddenly I was in a forest where there were trees that were big enough for me to climbing, because they didn't exist here when I was a kid. Trees that were big enough for me to climb in, there weren't any. They're just near where I grew up. There simply wasn't. So for me, I vividly remember being 6 years old and yay, climbing up a tree in Hallormsstaðaskógur, and that for me was that was the greatest thing. And also because I was the nerdy kid that read all fairy tales and folk tales, and so much of them take place in a forest. The forest is where the adventures happen.
It's where the magic happens.
Yes.
Yeah.